What's my story? It's not about being famous on the internet.
We're live in Santa Barbara.
It's about everything I do. Hey guys.
Who I am can inspire others.
I'm just starting. Watch me grow.
Hey guys, this is Paul, and this is the Canon T6, one of the cheapest DSLRs on the market. I wanted to see what sort of quality I could get out of this budget camera, so I bought a bundle that included this 18 to 55mm kit lens and this 75 to 300mm telephoto lens. Starting out with the camera body itself, it feels surprisingly great for the price with pretty much the same build quality as my Canon 90D. However, taking a closer look, you will see that there are several compromises made in terms of features on the T6. There's no top LCD, there's no scroll wheel on the back, there are fewer dedicated buttons, and a less pronounced grip. All of these are pretty reasonable sacrifices in my opinion, but what's harder to work with is the lack of a flip-out display, touchscreen, and a microphone input jack. These are all key features that I use all the time on my 90D, especially when I'm filming myself for videos. Since the Canon T6 supports wireless connectivity to smartphones through the Canon camera app, I thought I would be able to just use my smartphone as a monitor. But when I connected, I found out that this feature is only available for photo mode and not available in video mode. So that's really disappointing because that would have been incredibly useful for video monitoring. So to get features like self-monitoring and a better microphone than the onboard one on the T6, you'd have to invest in something like an external monitor and a separate microphone to sync in post. What really matters most with any camera is the actual image quality. So I'll start off with reviewing the T6's photos and then move on to video. So the photos I was able to get with this thing really impressed me. They're very sharp because of that 18 megapixel sensor with good color accuracy. Canon is known for their great color science, and I can push the raw files really far in post. Check out this picture I took of a plane flying into the sunset. The original image is completely overexposed and blown out, but I was able to pull all of this color out through some pretty simple editing because that information was still retained in the original raw file. And when I actually compared the T6 to my 90D, I was blown away by how similar the two were. Obviously, the 90D was a little bit sharper because of its 32 megapixel sensor, while the T6 has just 18 megapixels. But other than that, the photos from these two were very similar in terms of color reproduction and overall quality. But one area that I did notice a pretty big difference in was low light conditions. First off, the T6 is limited to just 6400 ISO, while the 90D can go up to 25,600. But more importantly, the 90D just shows much less noise at the same ISO levels as the T6. In this comparison shot, both images were taken at ISO 6400, but the T6 shows much more noise. The noise is pretty visible from ISO 800 and up, and 1600 is probably about the highest I would want to go before the noise just becomes too noticeable. So I'd say that this camera definitely performs much better in properly lit environments. I think now is a good time to briefly go over the lenses that came with the bundle, just in case you're interested in purchasing the bundle. So you have your 18 to 55mm kit lens and the 75 to 300mm telephoto. And these lenses might be cheap, but for a beginner, they're more than enough to get you started in photography, especially the 18 to 55mm. The great thing about the 18 to 55 is that it has image stabilization, which helps a lot with handheld photography. This is also just a great focal range for beginners because you can shoot wide at 18mm for things like landscapes, but still have a bit of zoom for things like portraits or anything else that would require a zoom. The 75 to 300 is a usable telephoto lens, but it would be a whole lot better if it had image stabilization, because when shooting at those longer focal lengths, any sort of shake in your hands is gonna decrease the sharpness of those photos. And I noticed this in my shots that I took with it during my testing. The photos were just a little bit on the soft side. But for how cheap these lenses are, I would say that they're definitely worth it. Moving back to the T6 body, let's talk settings. So you can adjust your sharpness, contrast, saturation, and color tone just like you can on the more expensive Canon DSLRs. But one downside is that interacting with the menus is a little bit more difficult and tedious without the touchscreen. So that slowed me down a lot when I was out shooting. And this brings me to one of my biggest complaints about the T6. The user experience is just not quite as fluid as I'd want it to be. For example, when I'm taking a picture with the 90D, even in live view mode, the dual pixel autofocus will lock in almost immediately and I can snap my picture and move on. With the T6, the autofocus is relatively fast when using the viewfinder, but when shooting in live view mode, it is just way too slow, sometimes taking up to 5 seconds or longer to lock in focus. This caused me to just barely miss focus in several shots, which was pretty disappointing to see. Thankfully, Canon does include what they call autofocus quick mode, and this is pretty interesting. It basically temporarily interrupts the live view image, focuses, and then changes back to live view mode. And this is much faster than just shooting in live view mode. This somewhat makes up for the issue, but it's obviously not an ideal solution, especially if you're trying to shoot a moving subject. Speaking of shooting moving subjects, if you are shooting in continuous mode, the T6 can take up to 3 frames per second, but pauses after just 6 shots if shooting in RAW mode. However, if you are taking continuous JPEGs, it appears to have an unlimited buffer depth, which is pretty nice. And moving on to video, I'll just say that the T6 isn't great for the way I like to shoot video. It can shoot up to 1080p videos at 30 frames per second, but it does look to be a bit on the soft side, even when I compare it to my 1080p footage shot with my 90D. And video on the T6 has 2 major drawbacks, one of which I already mentioned, the lack of a flip out display, but the other is the lack of continuous autofocus. This means that you'll have to use manual focus for everything you're shooting, which makes things a lot more difficult, especially if you're shooting in a shallow depth of field or filming a moving subject. But if you can get by without autofocus, a flip out display, and don't forget that there's no microphone input jack, the T6 is definitely usable for video. So all in all, is the T6 worth it? I would say absolutely if you're looking for a solid budget DSLR to get started in photography. Especially with the bundle, you'll get 2 lenses and a camera body capable of shooting very high quality pictures. However, if video is your main focus, I'd probably look elsewhere. But for photos and the occasional video, the T6 is still a great budget option.